Well, welcome back. Assignment day. Do you think that at 12 years old, you're old enough to stop going to school and to have your job? And that job is picked from a bag? Interesting times. This Ember place. Let's find out more. Chapter 2, A Message to the Mayor. Lena often took different routes between school and home. Sometimes, just for variety, she'd go all the way around Spark Swallow Square, or way up by the shoe repair shops on Livery Street. But today, she took the shortest route because she was eager to get home and tell her news. Now, you know that there's a map at the front of the book, right? And it shows you the City of Ember. And it's got all of the streets labeled. It's an excellent map. So if you have the map, you can figure out where Lena's going and where she's been by looking at the map and comparing it with the street she's talking about. So check it out. You might find some interesting stuff about the City of Ember. Ooh. Continuing on. She ran fast and easily through the streets of Ember. Every corner, every alley, every building was familiar to her. She always knew where she was, though most of the streets looked more or less the same. All of them were lined with old two-story stone buildings, the wood of their window frames and doors long and painted. On the street level, there were shops. Above the shops, there were apartments where people lived. Every building, at the place where the wall met the roof, was equipped with a row of floodlights, big, cone-shaped lamps that cast a strong yellow glare. Stone walls, lighted windows, lumpy muffled shapes of people. Lena flew by them. Her slender legs felt immensely strong, like the wood of a bow that flexes and springs. She darted around obstacles, broken furniture left for the trash heaps or for the scavengers, stoves and refrigerators that were past repair, peddlers sitting on the pavement with their wares spread out around them. She leapt over cracks and potholes. When she came to Hafter Street, she slowed a little. This street was deep in shadow. 4 of its street lamps were out and had not been fixed. For a second, Lena thought about the rumors she'd heard about the light bulbs, that some kind were completely gone. She was used to shortages of things. Everyone was. But not light bulbs. If the bulbs for the street lamps ran out, the only lights would be inside the buildings. What would happen then? How could people find their way through streets in the dark? Somewhere inside her, a black worm of dread stirred. She thought about Dune's outburst in class. Could things really be as bad as he said? She didn't want to believe it. She pushed the thought away. As she turned onto Budlow Street, she sped up again. She passed a line of customers waiting to get into the vegetable market, their shopping bags draped over their arms. At the corner of Oliver Street, she dodged a group of washers trudging along with bags of laundry, and some movers carrying away a broken table. She passed a street sweeper, shoving dust around with his broom. I am so lucky, she thought, to have the job I want, and because of Dune Harrow, of all people. When they were younger, Lena and Dune had been friends. Together they had explored the back alleys and dimly lit edges of the city. But in the 4th year of school, they had begun to grow apart. It started one day during the hour of free time, when the children in their class were playing on the front steps of the school. I can go down the steps 3 at a time, someone would boast. I can hop down on 1 foot, someone would say. The others would chime in. I can do handstand against the pillar. I can leapfrog over the trash can. And as soon as one child did something, all the rest would do it too, to prove that they could. Lena could do it all. Even when the dares got wilder, she yelled out the wildest one of all. I can climb the light pole. For a second, everyone just stared at her. But Lena dashed across the street, took off her shoes and socks, wrapped herself around the cold metal of the pole. Pushing with her bare feet, she inched upward. She didn't get very far before she lost her grip and fell back down. The children laughed, and so did she. "I didn't say I could climb to the top," she explains. "I just said I'd climb it." The others swarmed forward to try. Lizzie wouldn't take off her socks. Her feet were too cold, she said, and so she kept sliding back. 40 Pen wasn't strong enough to get more than a foot above the ground. Next came Dune. He took his shoes and socks off and placed them neatly at the foot of the pole. Then he announced in his serious way, "I am going to the top." He clasped the pole and started upward, pushing with his feet, his knees sticking out to the sides. He pulled himself upward, pushed again. He was higher now than Lena had been, but suddenly his hand slid and he came plummeting down. He landed on his bottom with his legs poking up in the air. Lena laughed. She shouldn't have. He might have been hurt. But he looked so funny that she just couldn't help it. He wasn't hurt. He could have jumped up, grinned, and walked away, but Dune didn't take things lightly. When he heard Lena and the others laughing, his face darkened. His temper rose in him like hot water. "Don't you dare laugh at me," he said to Lena. "I did better than you did. It was a stupid idea anyway, stupid idea to climb that pole." And as he was shouting, red in the face, their teacher, Mrs. Polster, came out to the steps and saw him. She took him by the shirt collar to the school director's office, where he got the scolding he didn't think he deserved. After that day, Lena and Dune barely looked at each other when they passed in the hallway. At first, it was because they were fuming about what had happened. Dune didn't like being laughed at. Lena didn't like being shouted at. After a while, the memory of the light pole incident faded, but by then, they had gotten out of the habit of friendship. By the time they were 12, they knew each other only as classmates. Lena was friends with Vindy Chance, Orly Gordon, and most of all, red-haired Lizzie Biscoe, who could run almost as fast as Lena and could talk 3 times faster. Now, as Lena sped toward home, she felt immensely grateful to Dune and hoped he'd come to no harm in the pipeworks. Maybe they'd be friends again. She'd like to ask him about the pipeworks. She was curious about it. When she got to Greystone Street, she passed Clary Lane, who was probably on her way to the greenhouses. Clary waved to her and called out, "What job?" And Lena called back, "Messenger!" and ran on. Lena lived in Quilliam Square, over the yarn shop run by her grandmother. When she got to the shop, she burst in the door and cried, "Granny, I'm a messenger!" Granny's shop had once been a tidy place, where each ball of yarn and spool of thread had its spot in the cubby holes that lined the walls. All the yarn and thread came from old clothes that had gotten too shabby to be worn. Granny unraveled shredders and picked apart dresses, jackets, and pants. She wound the yarn onto balls and the thread onto spools, and people bought them to use in making new clothes. These days, the shop was a mess. Long loops and strands of yarn dangled out of the cubby holes, and the browns and grays and purples were mixed in with the ochres and olive greens and dark blues. Granny's customers often had to spend half an hour unsnarling the rust-red yarn from the mud brown, or trying to fish out the end of a thread from a tangled wad. Granny wasn't much help. Most days she just dozed behind the counter in her rocking chair. And that's where she was when Lena burst in with her news. Lena saw that Granny had forgotten to knot up her hair that morning. It was standing out from her head in a wild white frizz. Granny stood up looking puzzled. "You aren't a messenger, my dear. You're a schoolgirl," she said. "But Granny, today was assignment day, and I got my job. I am a messenger." Granny's eyes lit up, and she slapped her hand down on the counter. "I remember," she cried. "Messenger! That's a grand job. You'll be great at it." Lena's little sister toddled out from behind the counter on unsteady legs. She had a round face and round brown eyes. At the top of her head was a sprig of brown hair tied up with a scrap of red yarn. She grabbed onto Lena's knees. "Weena! Weena!" she said. Lena bent over and took the child's hand. "Poppy, your big sister got a good job. Are you happy, Poppy? Are you proud of me?" Poppy said something that sounded like, "Hoppy, hoppy, hoppy." Lena laughed, hoisted her up, and danced with her around the shop. Lena loved her little sister so much that it was like an ache under her ribs. The baby and Granny were all the family she had now. 2 years ago, when the coughing sickness was raging through the city again, her father had died. Some months later, her mother, giving birth to Poppy, had died too. Lena missed her parents with an ache that was as strong as what she felt for Poppy, only it was a hollow feeling instead of a full one. "When do you start?" said Granny. "Tomorrow," said Lena. "I report to the messenger station at 8 o'clock. "You'll be a famous messenger," said Granny. "Fast and famous." Taking Poppy with her, Lena went out of the shop and climbed the stairs to their apartment. It was a small apartment, only 4 rooms, but there was enough stuff to fill 20. There were things that had belonged to Lena's parents, her grandparents, and even their grandparents. Old, broken, cracked, threadbare things that had been patched and repaired dozens or hundreds of times. People in Ember rarely threw anything away. They made the best possible use of what they had. In Lena's apartment, layers of worn rugs and carpets covered the floor, making it soft but uneven underfoot. Against one wall squatted a sagging couch with round wooden balls for legs, and on the couch were blankets and pillows, so many that you had to toss some on the floor before you could sit down. Against the opposite wall stood 2 wobbly tables that held a cluster of plates and bottles, cups and bowls, unmatching forks and spoons, little piles of scratched paper, bits of string wound around in untidy wads, and a few stubby pencils. There were 4 lamps, 2 tall ones that stood on the floor and 2 short ones that stood on tables. And in uneven lines near the ceiling were hooks that held coats and shawls and nightgowns and sweaters, shelves that held pots and pans and jars with unreadable labels, and boxes of buttons and pins and tacks. Where there were no shelves, the walls had been decorated with things of beauty. A label from a can of peaches. A few dried yellow squash blossoms. A strip of faded but still pretty purple cloth. There were drawings, too. Lena had done the drawings out of her imagination. They showed a city that looked somewhat like Ember, except that its buildings were lighter and taller and had more windows. One of the drawings had fallen to the floor. Lena retrieved it and pinned it back up. She stood for a minute and looked at the pictures. Over and over, she'd drawn the same city. Sometimes she drew it as seen from afar. Sometimes she chose one of its buildings and drew it in detail. She put in stairways and street lamps and carts. Sometimes she tried to draw the people who lived in the city, though she wasn't good at drawing people. Their heads always came out too small and their hands looked like spiders. One picture showed a scene in which the people of the city greeted her as she arrived. The first person they had ever seen to come from elsewhere. They argued with each other about who should be the first to invite her home. Lena could see the city so clearly in her mind, she almost believed it was real. She knew it couldn't be, though. The book of the City of Ember, which all children studied in school, taught otherwise. "The City of Ember was made for us long ago by the builders," the book said. "It is the only light in the dark world. Beyond Ember, the darkness goes on forever, in all directions." Lena had been to the outer border of Ember. She had stood at the edge of the trash heaps and gazed into the darkness beyond the city, the unknown regions. No one had ever gone far into the unknown regions, or at least no one had gone far and returned. And no one had ever arrived in Ember from the unknown regions either. As far as anyone knew, the darkness did go on forever. Still, Lena wanted the other city to exist. In her imagination, it was so beautiful and it seemed so real. Sometimes she longed to go there and take everyone in Ember with her. But she wasn't thinking about the other city now. Today, she was happy to be right where she was. She set Poppy on the couch. "Wait there," she said, and she went into the kitchen, where there was an electric stove and a refrigerator that no longer worked and was used to store glasses and dishes so Poppy couldn't get at them. Above the refrigerator were shelves holding more pots and jars, more spoons and knives, a wind-up clock that Granny always forgot to wind, and a long row of cans. Lena tried to keep the cans in alphabetical order so she could find what she wanted quickly, but Granny always messed them up. Now she saw there were beans at the end of the row and tomatoes at the beginning. She picked out a can labeled baby drink and a jar of boiled carrots, opened them, poured the liquid into a cup and the carrots into a little dish, and took them back to the baby on the couch. Poppy dribbled baby drink down her chin. She ate some of her carrots and poked others between the couch cushions. For the moment, Lena felt almost perfectly happy. There was no need to think about the fate of the city right now. Tomorrow, she'd be a messenger. She wiped the orange goop off Poppy's chin. "Don't worry," she said. "Everything will be all right." That's the first part of this chapter. I'll continue it in a minute.